Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Ukraine claims major long-range missile strike on key Russian airfields. Maduro, Venezuelan opposition agree to freer election in 2024. Canadian politicians are starting to grapple with the ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war. Biden heads to Israel with war plans and Hamas hostages on the agenda. A busy summer pushes United Airlines to a $1.14 billion profit, but fuel cost will hurt for Q results. Ukraine claims major long-range missile strike on key Russian airfields. CBC. Ukraine has claimed to have carried out one of the most destructive attacks on Russian air assets since the start of the war, using longer-range ballistic missiles allegedly donated by the U.S. Hours after the announcement, a U.S. official revealed that the missiles sought by Kyiv had been delivered quietly. Several U.S. officials confirmed that Washington provided Ukraine with a small number of the Army tactical missile system, as promised by President Joe Biden. The attack destroyed 9 Russian helicopters, military equipment, an air defense system, ammunition warehouses and runways. Dozens of Russian military personnel were injured. Maduro, Venezuelan opposition agree to freer election in 2024. Washington Post. The Venezuelan government and leaders from the U.S.-backed opposition have signed an agreement committing to hold competitive presidential elections in 2024. The deal is expected to result in the U.S. easing oil sanctions on Venezuela. President Nicolas Maduro has pledged to allow all parties to choose their candidates, allow international observers, and grant fair access to the media. However, the government has not promised to lift bans on some opposition candidates. The agreement was formalized in Barbados with the facilitation of the Norwegian government and U.S. representatives. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven reserves of crude oil. Canadian politicians are starting to grapple with the ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war. CBC. Canadian political leaders are grappling with the aftermath of Hamas's attack on Israel and the ongoing conflict between the two sides. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has stated that Israel has the right to defend itself in accordance with international law, but he also emphasized the importance of upholding international law and humanitarian principles. The leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, supported Israel's right to defend itself, but also expressed concern for the lives of innocent civilians and called for safe zones and a humanitarian corridor in Gaza. The New Democratic Party, NDP, has taken a stronger stance, calling for a ceasefire and accusing Israel of violating international law. Other Liberal MPs have also criticized Israel's actions. This marks the first major crack in the Canadian political consensus on Israel's response to Hamas's attacks, and more divisions may emerge in the future. The article also notes the importance of acting in accordance with international law and the lessons that can be learned from past conflicts, such as the aftermath of 9/11. Political leaders must balance their support for allies with their commitment to principles and values. Biden heads to Israel with war plans and Hamas hostages on the agenda. The Independent. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden is visiting Israel in an attempt to prevent the conflict with Hamas from escalating into a wider regional war. The visit is intended to show U.S. support for Israel. However, there is a growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza due to constant Israeli airstrikes and pressure from families of hostages taken by Hamas to bring them home. The family of a British teenager, who was killed in a Hamas attack 10 days ago, have confirmed that her younger sister and father are still missing. Hamas released a video of one of the hostages taken into Gaza, showing a French-Israeli woman with her arm bandaged. The woman's mother has pleaded for her daughter's return. Biden will be aware of the difficulty of rescuing the hostages, particularly given the state of Gaza after the bombings. He is expected to travel to Jordan to meet with King Abdullah and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to discuss the situation in Gaza. Biden's meeting with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has been cancelled due to an Israeli strike on a hospital. The ground offensive, which had been expected, has been postponed, possibly until after Biden's visit. A busy summer pushes United Airlines to a $1.14 billion profit, but fuel cost will hurt for Q results. Associated Press. United Airlines has said that it expects its adjusted profit for Q4 to be between $1.50 and $1.80 per share, which is far short of Wall Street expectations of $2.09 per share. The company has blamed surging jet fuel prices and the suspension of flights to Tel Aviv during the Israel-Hamas war for the weaker-than-expected forecast. Biden considering $100 billion funding request that includes Israel, Ukraine aid source. Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden may request a supplemental spending bill of approximately $100 billion that includes defense aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan, according to sources. The request is expected to cover a full year of funding, with Israel asking for $10 billion following an attack by Hamas militants. Congress has already approved $113 billion in assistance to Ukraine since Russia invaded its territory. Senate leaders anticipate receiving the request by the end of the week, with Democrats aiming to deliver support for Israel and other items in the package. A classified briefing on the situation in Israel and Gaza will be held for the Senate on Wednesday. Why aid for Gaza is still stuck near Rafah crossing in Egypt. Washington Post. The Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt remains closed, and questions and confusion remain over why this is the case. On Monday, trucks filled with aid lined the road in Arish, the closest city in Egypt, while foreigners and dual nationals crowded the gates on the Palestinian side. However, Israel and Hamas denied that an agreement was reached, and Egypt has its own political and security concerns, and wants to avoid having a large number of Palestinians crossing into Egypt. Israeli officials said last week that no aid can enter Gaza until Israeli hostages captured by Hamas are released. Israel is also concerned about weapons being smuggled into Gaza through aid convoys. Over the weekend, officials discussed the possibility of setting up a screening mechanism that would allow the Israelis to inspect goods entering Gaza, the Washington Post reported. In the meantime, as the humanitarian situation inside Gaza worsens, hundreds of tons of aid remain stuck on the Egyptian side of the crossing despite growing international calls to provide relief to Gazan civilians. Destruction at Gaza hospital increases stakes for Biden's trip to Israel and Jordan. The Toronto Star. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas has cancelled his planned meetings with President Joe Biden to protest an explosion at a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza has blamed the blast on an Israeli airstrike. However, the Israeli military said it had not been involved, and pinned the blame on a misfired Palestinian rocket. The situation is becoming increasingly volatile, and will test the limits of American influence in the region. As the humanitarian crisis grows, the concern is that the conflict will escalate and spread beyond the borders of Gaza. Skirmishes have already taken place on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah, an Iran-backed group based in southern Lebanon. Biden's visit to the region is fraught with risk. However, he is committed to both Ukraine and Israel, and has said that the U.S. has the capacity to help and an obligation to do so. He has shown public support for Israel while privately expressing concerns to the Israelis about their behavior. Mahmoud Abbas cancels meeting with Joe Biden, amid claims of strike on Gaza hospital. ABC. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has cancelled a meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden after an Israeli strike on a Gaza hospital that reportedly killed hundreds. Abbas's decision comes amid escalating tensions between Israel and Palestine, with ongoing violence and protests in the region. The cancellation of the meeting with Biden indicates the deteriorating relationship between the U.S. and Palestine, as the latter accuses Israel of committing war crimes. Israel blames Palestinian militants after hospital bombing kills hundreds in Gaza. ABC. Health authorities in Gaza have reported that an airstrike has killed hundreds of Palestinians at a Gaza hospital. However, Israel's military has denied responsibility, claiming that the hospital was hit by a failed rocket launch by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad military group. The reported strike is the bloodiest single incident since Israel launched its bombing campaign in retaliation for Hamas's attack on Israel in early October. The United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency has also reported that an Israeli airstrike killed at least 6 people at one of its schools, which was being used as a shelter for displaced people. Trump appeals gag order barring attacks on witnesses in D.C. case. Bloomberg. Donald Trump is appealing a partial gag order that prohibits him from publicly criticizing witnesses, prosecutors, and court staff involved in the federal election obstruction case against him in Washington. Trump's lawyers filed notice on Tuesday that they are challenging the order by U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan a day after she announced it in court and hours after it was officially entered on the docket. Trump's team is also expected to ask Chutkan put the speech restrictions on hold until the end of the appeal process, which could include taking the fight to the U.S. Supreme Court, according to a person familiar with the situation. How the U.S. will cut off China from more AI chips. Reuters. The Biden administration has updated restrictions on the export of advanced artificial intelligence, AI, to China and other countries. The measures aim to prevent China from acquiring the cutting-edge chips required for developing AI technologies. The new rules will control a broader range of chips based on computing power alone, require chip companies to notify U.S. authorities when selling chips just below restriction limits, and close loopholes related to the use of chiplets. In addition, 2 Chinese chip startups, Biren and More Threads, were added to a U.S. trade blacklist, limiting their access to chip manufacturers. CNN poll: Americans overwhelmingly side with auto workers in ongoing union strike. CNN. A new CNN poll finds that a majority of Americans side with unionized auto workers in their ongoing strike against major car companies. 76% of respondents say their sympathies lie more with the striking workers, while only 23% side with the employers. However, most Americans also say that elected officials should generally stay out of disputes between private employers and labor unions. Additionally, the poll found that 75% of U.S. adults believe it is harder for people like them to get ahead financially than it was a generation ago. Can police officers smoke pot? Jersey City says no. Wall Street Journal. Jersey City has filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging the workplace protections of New Jersey's recreational marijuana law. The city is asking the court to rule that a federal law barring drug users from possessing firearms preempts New Jersey's marijuana law. Jersey City also wants to block the state from forcing it to reinstate police officers who failed drug tests for cannabis. The lawsuit relies on the Gun Control Act of 1968, the same law that was recently used to indict President Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Tuesday evening news briefing: Israel to delay Gaza invasion until after Biden visit. Telegraph. Israel has reportedly delayed its ground assault on Gaza until after U.S. President Joe Biden's visit. An Israeli news site said the attack had been postponed to an unknown date, but would take place once Biden had left the country. The delay is said to have caused frustration among some military commanders who believe it will give Hamas more time to prepare. In a separate development, the British family of a teenager missing since the recent Hamas attack has said that she has been murdered. U.S. secures Marshall Islands military deal, blunts China in vital Pacific region. South China Morning Post. The Biden administration has secured a deal with the Marshall Islands to renew a strategic pact that grants the U.S. military access to the region in exchange for economic assistance. The agreement allows the U.S. to maintain its ability to deny other nations access to a strategically significant area of the Pacific. The renewal offers $2.3 billion over 20 years, 4 times the amount initially offered by the Biden administration. The deal also addresses the Marshall Islands' demand for compensation for U.S. nuclear tests carried out between 1946 and 1958. The Biden administration has allocated over $7 billion for the region in its 2024 budget. Republican-led U.S. House rejects Trump ally Jim Jordan for Speaker on first vote. South China Morning Post. Right-wing Republican and former ally of Donald Trump, Jim Jordan, fell short in a vote to serve as Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Jordan won 200 votes, short of the 217 needed to win the job, as 20 of his fellow Republicans voted against him. Despite this, he is expected to wear down his opponents in subsequent votes. If he wins, Jordan, who has spent years fighting with leaders of his own party, would occupy one of the most powerful jobs in Washington, putting him second in line for the presidency. Private investment needed to scale up low-carbon hydrogen power, Wood Mackenzie. Reuters. A report by consultancy Wood Mackenzie has stated that considerable private investment is needed to scale up the low-carbon hydrogen economy in the United States by 2030. The report comes after the Biden administration announced $7 billion in federal grants for 7 proposed hydrogen hubs across 16 states. Wood Mackenzie estimates that the $7 billion represents less than 10% of the support expected for U.S. hydrogen production facility developers, and that $40 billion of private investment is needed to drive momentum in the industry. The report also highlights uncertainties around low-carbon hydrogen project announcements, and states that the Department of Energy's goal of reducing hydrogen power to $1 per kilogram by 2031 is currently out of reach for green hydrogen. Trump's statements pose grave threats to court proceedings, Judge Chutkan says in written gag order. CNN. A U.S. judge has issued a gag order barring former President Donald Trump from publicly discussing witnesses in his federal election subversion case. Tanya Chutkan, a district judge, wrote that Trump's public statements posed grave threats to the integrity of these proceedings, particularly when they could be seen as harassment or intimidation. She said Trump was still able to criticize the government and make claims of political motivation. Chutkan's order applies to all parties in the case, their counsel and others who may make public statements about it. Live updates: Jordan loses first vote for House Speaker, but more rounds of balloting are expected. The Toronto Star. The House of Representatives has rejected Jim Jordan's nomination for Speaker 2 weeks after the chamber ousted Kevin McCarthy from the top spot. Jordan scrambled unsuccessfully to shore up the votes needed to clinch the speakership in the closely divided chamber. He could only afford to lose a few GOP votes to win the nod. Jordan has come up short in the first round of voting for House Speaker. The Ohio congressman did even worse than Kevin McCarthy did on the first balloting of his election back in January. Jordan lost 20 Republican votes, well more than the 3 he could spare to win the Speaker's gavel. More rounds of voting are expected as Jordan works to shore up support to replace McCarthy for the job, and the leader of the GOP's hard-right flank moves to take a central seat of U.S. power. But it's unclear when the next vote will take place. The Jordan holdouts are a mix of pragmatists, ranging from seasoned legislators and committee chairs worried about governing to newer lawmakers from districts where their voters back home prefer President Joe Biden to former President Donald Trump. Jordan appears to be talking to some Republicans about switching their vote after he appears to come up short on the first round. 20 Republicans have voted against Jordan, an outcome way worse than his allies were hoping for. Hey there, folks. It's your resident 6 doctor, coming at you with all the latest news from the 6 Degrees world. Let's dive right in. First up, Ukraine claims to have launched a major missile strike on Russian airfields, using missiles allegedly donated by the U.S. This attack resulted in the destruction of several Russian military assets and injuries to Russian military personnel. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, the government and opposition have agreed to hold freer elections in 2024, potentially leading to the easing of U.S. oil sanctions on the country. In Canada, political leaders are grappling with the ramifications of the Israel-Hamas war. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has expressed support for Israel's right to defend itself, but also emphasized the importance of upholding international law and humanitarian principles. The New Democratic Party has taken a stronger stance, calling for a ceasefire and accusing Israel of violating international law. This marks a crack in the Canadian political consensus on the issue. Speaking of Israel, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden is heading there to prevent the conflict with Hamas from escalating further. However, there are growing concerns about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the fate of hostages taken by Hamas. Biden's visit is fraught with risk, but he is committed to helping both Israel and Ukraine, and has expressed concerns to the Israelis about their behavior. In other news, United Airlines is expecting a weaker than expected profit for the fourth quarter due to surging fuel prices and the suspension of flights to Tel Aviv during the Israel-Hamas war. And speaking of Israel, President Biden is considering a $100 billion funding request that includes defense aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. Moving on, the situation in Gaza remains dire, with trucks filled with aid waiting at the closed Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt. The reasons for the closure are unclear, but both Israel and Hamas have denied that an agreement was reached. Israel is concerned about weapons being smuggled into Gaza through aid convoys. In the U.S., former President Donald Trump is appealing a gag order that prohibits him from publicly criticizing witnesses and others involved in his federal election obstruction case. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has updated restrictions on the export of advanced artificial intelligence to China, aiming to prevent China from acquiring cutting-edge chips needed for AI development. In a CNN poll, a majority of Americans expressed support for unionized auto workers in their ongoing strike against major car companies. However, most Americans also believe that elected officials should generally stay out of disputes between private employers and labor unions. Jersey City has filed a lawsuit challenging the workplace protections of New Jersey's recreational marijuana law, arguing that federal law barring drug users from possessing firearms preempts the state's marijuana law. The city also wants to block the state from forcing it to reinstate police officers who failed drug tests for cannabis. And finally, Israel has reportedly delayed its ground assault on Gaza until after President Biden's visit. This delay has caused frustration among some military commanders who believe it will give Hamas more time to prepare. In the meantime, the British family of a missing teenager has sadly announced that she has been murdered. Phew. That was a lot to cover. Now it's time to hear from you, my lovely viewers. What are your thoughts on these news stories? Do you have any burning questions? Let's get the discussion going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.